protecting your home or going out hunting. Those are just, things that the people that wrote the Constitution just kind of took for granted. These days hunting might be seen a little bit strange, but because we have supermarkets. But the thing is that what the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is really there for is to give the people the authority or the ability to reject tyranny by their own government. And that's what they saw when they were under, British rule, and they wanted to ensure that in future generations they would actually have, they would be able to block this from occurring. Now, in Article 1, Section 8, in the powers of Congress, there's an interesting phrase. It says, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use should be for longer term than 2 years. It's kind of weird. And then they say, to provide and maintain a Navy. So with the Navy, they said to provide and maintain, but with an Army, they only said that they should be around for, at most, a maximum of 2 years. And they tried to leave a lot for the defense, actually, to the states. So what's actually in the Constitution, if you follow it strictly, is that, and again, modern days, obviously they didn't have an Air Force back then, but like a Navy, an Air Force, the sailors in the Navy, obviously, and the Marine Corps, which are principally naval soldiers, would be the defense of the country and would be provided and maintained for. But an army would be created, as needed to defend the country or to defend the country against and repel invasions. So,
Can I throw something?
Go right ahead, Paul.
We're looking, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking back in the days when most civilizations were based upon ocean. For instance, we live here in the Northeast. Take a look at the middle of the country. Well, you don't need a standing army once it's over, and most of our population was within the first 13 original colonies. And most nations were seafaring nations. Therefore, you had to have a standing navy to be able to defend your own commerce and your shipping from other foreign forces, pirates, et cetera, et cetera. So but it still stands to reason today.
Rose.
This morning there was it was an opinion of a person who felt that in the near future, within 10 years, our Navy would be dismantled, and because of the cost of maintaining a Navy. And it kind of shocked me to hear that. And I didn't realize that it was actually in here to provide and maintain a Navy.
Right.
So, that somewhere along the line he must have heard this and is picking up on that thought.
Right, and that's actually a pretty, actually if you go back to like World War I and World War II, for instance, like when World War II came about, they basically needed to create all these new battleships and aircraft carriers all over again. Actually, the battleship was kind of outdated by that time it came around. So that was the other thing that they kind of realized is the expenses of things you have to be very careful with. And what a lot of people don't realize is we actually spend more on our military in total than the rest of the world combined. And when people talk about being fiscally conservative, one of the things that a lot of times, especially in Congress right now, they never really talk about, trying to restrict or cut back on military expenditures. But the reality is, like, we're spending all this money and then we don't defend our borders, which is kind of like the constitutional mission, really. So, any other? Well, actually, I wanted to make one more comment actually on this. Go ahead.
I see it in what do you call it, sentence 15, to provide for calling the militia to execute laws of the Union. Now, if the militia is to protect the whole United States, now they're talking about it to protect the laws. That's like a police force.
Yeah.
And also it says to suppress insurrections.
Yep.
And that's, what is it, habeas corpus? They're not allowed to use the military. Sometimes they can't afterwards.
Right, and again, with the way that our military was structured at the time, whenever they used the word militia, and actually that follows in the power below it, the militia was supposed to be from the state. So the state of Pennsylvania or the state of New Jersey would really kind of have more or less the control over it. The citizens in the actual militia would be from those certain states. About 100 years ago, in the late 1890s, there was a fellow by the name of Elihu Root. I might have said his first name wrong. but he actually restreamed the whole, reorganized the entire armed forces and made it actually a bit more where he had different people from different states and broke down a lot of these militias, or what is now pretty much the National Guard. But, you know, as we use our National Guard, we have a lot of National Guardsmen in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. But
Which, by the way, is totally illegal.
about
These men and women are not supposed to serve more than 6 months active duty within that 2-year period. And some of these young fellows and gals, I have a young nephew now that's on his 3rd tour of duty, 2 in Iraq, he's now in Afghanistan, and it's uncalled for.
Well, 4 or 5 years ago, while I was reading a book that I was trying to read for a long time, there was a chapter in there about, or at least part of a chapter about Lincoln using soldiers to suppress riots in New York City, killed 1,000 people. Now, it took me a long time to watch the gangs in New York, which I didn't care about.
Right.
But when I watched it, and the end of it, that's exactly what they were talking about.
It was an Irish uprising.
Right,
against
because they, it
conscription.
was,
Right.
yeah,
They didn't like the
conscription.
draft.
yeah, there's actually quite a bit of that throughout history. Like, for instance, the Whiskey Rebellion, which actually I think went back to Washington. So even in the term of the first president, you still had a lot of these rebellions that would come up at certain points. And, you know, the causes of each one would obviously be different, but what they had in the Constitution was the ability of,
Yeah,
you know,
well,
it's-
we've got 2 conflicting statements here when it talks about
Yeah, I
the
have to agree a little
well-regulated
bit.
militia that's supposed to protect us from the government and allow us to overthrow the government if it gets too crazy. And then down here it says they're supposed to use the militia to stop from insurrection.
Yeah, now remember what the definition of a militia was back then. A militia was basically common folk that decided to arm themselves.
Right.
Which is actually pretty
But it said,
interesting.
it also, if I'm correct, it said well-regulated militia, did it not? Which means
Yes.
it had to be organized, even if it was at the state or the local level. They had to have drills, they had to, you know, when you regulate, that means you got some kind of a situation where it's like a military.
Yeah,
Actually-
we'll actually get into the meaning of regulate, what regular meant back then, because they used it a bunch of times. But actually back then, it didn't quite mean rules as much as to make regular or to make smooth. But yeah, so there would be some type of organization. It's
Right.
pretty much the same thing. What's interesting is actually the next power reads to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. So again, if you read it as the people that have enlisted in this army, enlisted in this militia, the Congress actually has this duty to provide the arming of them. So if you were actually to enact this, what it would really mean is anyone that was in the National Guard or anybody that wanted to be in this militia would be armed, you know, with an M16 or what have you. And so that's actually what it means. Obviously, Congress isn't, you know, walking around arming people. Go ahead.
On the internet, just yesterday under Jarrett Law, I think it was under where they said about Castro liking our health care system. Somebody brought up on the blog about, and they have the actual law, Arkansas has called out for manning a militia to keep control over the people. And it's under one of the blogs. And also that in Chicago, the education, you know, the education bill is connected to reconciliation. They bought military weapons, and there's a phone number for you to actually call to ask